The first kind of price discrimination we're going to discuss is perfect price discrimination. This is also known as first degree price discrimination, and it's a form of direct price discrimination. Okay. So what we see with perfect price discrimination is essentially the firm is able to identify to the cent exactly how much a consumer is willing to pay for a good before they even purchase it. Okay. So this would be like if you've ever watched the anime Death Note, where the Shinigami can see the names of people floating above their heads, right? That would be as if the firm could look at a consumer as they're walking in the door and see like, oh, okay, this person's willing to pay 16.37 for this water bottle or 8.42 for this chocolate bar, right? And then when the customer comes up to purchase the item, they charge them exactly that amount. If in order for the firm to engage in this type of perfect price discrimination, they of course have to have market power and be able to prevent resale, right? That's going to be the basic assumption for any and all forms of price discrimination. It also requires that the firms, or excuse me, that the customers have different demand curves. So the customers have to be willing to pay a different amount from others. And then lastly, the firm has to have complete information about each of their willingness to pay before they purchase, right? That's the only way that they're able to change that price tag that each individual consumer sees before they make a purchase. Now, probably as you're listening to this description, you're thinking like, oh, that sounds like really hard to do. How can any firm ever have that much information? And we act, and you would be right, right? It is hard to do, but we do see some firms existing in the real world that are able to engage in this type of discrimination. And you are actually exchanging with one right now, right? Universities are actually a really good perfect price discriminating firm. The reason they can do this is they have market power, right? Here at CSUSM, sure, we're at Cal State, but we're different from other Cal States. We're different from other local colleges as well, right? Different from UC San Diego, different from Palomar, right? The education you receive at Cal State San Marcos is a little bit different from any other. They have different faculty, different specialties, right? And we could go on. And Cal State San Marcos can also prevent resale, right? If you earn a degree, you can't transfer that to someone else. It's your degree and your degree only. Folks have different willingnesses to pay for college, right? If you are strapped for cash, you're maybe not going to be willing to pay as much as someone who has had a win, like maybe won the lottery, right? Or someone who has a really big college fund or who got a scholarship. And fourth, the university has basically every student's complete information on their willingness to pay, right? They know the income that the student earns, they know their parents' income and history of income because every student is filling out often the FAFSA, right, when they submit their application. And sometimes you're telling the university as well what other universities you're applying to. So if you're applying, if Cal State San Marcos is the only university you apply to, they're going to think, oh, okay, you really want to go here. You're not willing to go anywhere else. So you're going to be more willing to pay for this university than someone who's applying to 15 others, right? All throughout California. And so that information is going to adjust how they perceive your individual willingness to pay. And then even though the university has a listed tuition, they're able to vary that actual price for people by offering scholarships, by offering need-based funding, by offering work study, right, and other programs and support, financial support for students. And in that way, they change the price to fit exactly what you are willing to pay for this college degree. So as our perfectly price discriminating firm charges each customer their exact willingness to pay, what we see is that they walk the market down the demand curve. So every consumer pays exactly what they're willing to pay, that maximum value. And so what we see, we can look here graphically, is that the perfectly price discriminating monopoly produces the competitive amount, right? That amount that a perfectly competitive firm would also produce. they end up producing where price equals marginal cost. Okay, that's in comparison to our monopoly, where they're only producing that monopoly amount because they're producing where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay, what we also see is that our perfectly price discriminating monopoly captures all of the surplus available in the market, right? There's no deadweight loss, there's no consumer surplus, it's all producer surplus. Okay, whereas with our monopoly, there's some consumer surplus that's retained, there's some producer surplus that goes to the monopolist, and then there's some deadweight loss because the monopoly production is below the competitive amount. For our perfectly price discriminating firm, they're producing that competitive amount, so there's no deadweight loss, and then they're charging each consumer their willingness to pay as identified by the demand curve, and so they're able to capture all of the surplus. And so we get this really kind of funny outcome where the perfectly price discriminating monopoly, from the eyes of the economist, right, who's looking at the distribution of surplus, this perfectly price discriminating monopoly is just as efficient as the perfectly competitive firm, right? There's no deadweight loss, there's no inefficiency. And so if we were to look at the market for whatever the good is, right? Maybe it's university degrees from a sort of sky view, right? Aerial view. That perfectly price discriminating monopoly is going to look exactly the same as a perfectly competitive monopolist, right? There's no inefficiency. The competitive amount is produced, but in the case of the perfectly price discriminating monopoly, all of that surplus goes to producer, whereas in perfect competition, all of that surplus goes to the consumer. And the economist is equally happy with both of those outcomes, as long as there is no deadweight loss. Right? So that's a funny result of this perfectly price discriminating monopoly. We're going to do an example in the practice problems video for this lecture on chapter 10. So if you want to see an example right away, you can go ahead and skip there. Otherwise, the next video is going to look at segmenting, which is that second type of direct price discrimination, also known as third degree price discrimination.